Vivian Engine Works built the diesel engines that fishermen and tugboat operators on the BC coast trusted with their lives. Heavy, slow-turning machines cast in a North Vancouver foundry, designed to start in the morning and still be running when the operator's grandchildren took the wheel. Behind that trust was a company that delivered more than 600 engines to the Canadian military during the Second World War and became the dominant diesel builder of the Pacific Coast. They survived the conversion from sail to power, survived 2 world wars, survived the American imports that pushed north when the tariff walls came down. And then, after 40 years of building in Vancouver, the company simply vanished. The name erased, the records destroyed, the factory gone. But the engines didn't stop. How does a company whose engines are still running 80 years later simply cease to exist? What happened? Chapter 1. 60. Clementina Street, Vancouver, in 1890, was a city still rebuilding from its own ashes. 4 years earlier, a land-clearing fire had jumped the line and consumed everything west of Cambie Street in 45 minutes, the entire town, gone before the afternoon was out. What rose in its place was raw and restless. Roughly 13,000 people crowded onto a narrow spit of land between Burrard Inlet and False Creek, hemmed in by timber so thick you could walk 50 miles north without seeing sky. Sawmills lined the inlet shore, their blades screaming through Douglas fir logs that had taken 3 centuries to grow and 20 minutes to fall. Steam tugs hauled log booms through water brown with bark and sawdust. To the south, the salmon canneries of Steveston were pulling millions of fish a year out of the Fraser River, packing them into tins stamped with names like Sockeye and Imperial, and shipping them to tables in London and Toronto. This was not a refined city. It was an industrial frontier dressed in rain, and every wheel in it turned on imported iron. Will Vivian was born into this place on the 14th of May, 1890. His city was young enough to remember its own creation. British Columbia had joined Confederation only 19 years earlier, on the promise of a transcontinental railway that didn't arrive until 1886, the same year the fire took the town. But Vancouver was growing at a pace that startled even the boosters. Between the Great Fire and Vivian's first birthday, the population had climbed from barely 1,000 to roughly 14,000. People pouring in by rail and by steamer, drawn by the lumber trade and the promise of a Pacific gateway. The CPR terminus had brought Eastern capital. Lumber money brought ambition. And the salmon runs, those massive, ancient, almost incomprehensible migrations of sockeye, coho, chum, and pink salmon from the open Pacific into the rivers of the coast, brought something more fundamental. An industry that needed engines. The gillnet boats of the Fraser and the Skeena were still powered by sail and oar when Vivian was a boy. Japanese-Canadian fishermen, Norwegians, Croatians, First Nations families who'd worked these waters for thousands of years. They hauled their catches by muscle and wind, the same way their fathers had. The canneries didn't care how the fish arrived, only that it arrived fresh. But down the American coast, in the machine shops of San Francisco and Oakland, something was shifting. Small, rugged gasoline engines, 1-cylinder, 4-cycle, slow-turning, were being built that could push a 20-foot fishing boat against the current without a crew breaking their backs at the oars. The internal combustion engine was coming to the Pacific, and the men who could build them would own the coast. Vivian went looking for that knowledge. As a teenager, he left Vancouver and headed south to San Francisco, to the Imperial Gas Engine Company at 60 Clementina Street, a low brick building in the industrial block south of Market Street, one of the key workshops in the West Coast's emerging engine trade. San Francisco in those years was the machine shop capital of the Pacific, the place where mining equipment, marine engines, and agricultural machinery were designed, cast, and shipped to every port from Puget Sound to Valparaiso. A young man with steady hands could walk from shop to shop along the numbered streets south of the slot and learn a different discipline in each one: foundry work, pattern making, machining, assembly. At Imperial, Vivian learned the American School of Engine Building from the castings up. Heavy, slow, reliable. 4-cycle, long-stroke, thick-walled cylinders designed to run for years without complaint. The philosophy was brutally simple. An engine that lasted decades beat an engine that turned fast. Speed was for racing boats and show-offs. The Pacific was no place for either. Vivian absorbed this conviction the way you absorb a religion in your youth, completely, permanently, and with a certainty that no subsequent evidence would shake. He had no way of knowing, working at his lathe on Clementina Street, that Imperial Gas Engine Co. would one day merge and evolve into Atlas Imperial Diesel Engine Co., the very firm that would become his chief competitor on the Pacific Coast. The master's shop would produce its own rival. In 1909, 19 years old and back in Vancouver, he founded the Vivian Engine Works. He started where every Pacific Coast engine builder started, with small 1- and 2-cylinder gasoline engines for fish boats, the one-lungers, that were transforming the gillnet fleet from sail to power, one boat at a time. The market was simple and immediate. A fisherman would walk into the shop with cash from the previous season's catch, describe his boat and his waters, and walk out with a delivery date. A few blocks away, on West Georgia Street at Cole Harbor, the East Hope brothers, Peter and Ernest, were doing the same thing from a shop at 1745 West Georgia. The two firms weren't rivals so much as neighbors in a trade so young that everyone knew everyone else's castings by sight. Vivian worked as a helper at East Hope Brothers until 1916, learning what they knew while building what they couldn't: larger units, heavier frames, engines designed for the deeper, rougher work of the open Pacific rather than the sheltered waters of the inlet. The East Hopes built for fishermen close to home. Vivian was already thinking about tugboats. What gave him his foothold wasn't genius alone. It was geography. The Rocky Mountains cut British Columbia off from eastern Canadian engine makers as completely as an ocean. American engines faced a steep tariff wall that had been raised again after 1907. A tugboat skipper on the BC coast whose engine failed couldn't telephone Hamilton or Detroit and expect a replacement before the season ended. He needed someone local, someone who cast the block in Vancouver, machined it in Vancouver, and could fix it in Vancouver when the salt water and the hours finally wore something down. The continent didn't offer Vivian a choice. It offered him a captive market, if he had the skill to fill it. He did. And the company he built from that skill: one man, one shop, one conviction about how an engine should be made, would grow into something that powered an entire coast. Chapter 2. The First Canadian Diesel. Through the 1910s, Vivian's shop grew with the fleet it served. Every season brought more orders as the last sailing gillnetters converted to power, and the tugboat operators on Burrard Inlet discovered that a Vivian one-lunger could haul a log boom through a cross-current that would have stalled a lighter machine. The customers weren't gentlemen yachtsmen. They were Japanese-Canadian families running seiners out of Steveston, where the smell of salmon and salt hung in the air from April to October. Norwegian trollers who'd come to the BC coast because the fishing reminded them of home: cold water, big timber, long days. Croatian gillnetters on the Skeena who worked in crews and shared the season's take. First Nations fishermen whose relationship with the salmon predated European settlement by millennia. These were the people who kept Vivian's shop running. Men who judged an engine not by its catalog specifications, but by whether it brought them home. They didn't want sophistication. They wanted iron they could trust. But gasoline had a problem that every wooden-hulled operator understood in his bones. Gasoline vapor is heavier than air. It sinks. It pools in the bilge of a fishing boat like an invisible lake, and one spark, from a loose wire, a backfiring cylinder, a dropped wrench striking steel, turns a wooden hull into a funeral pyre in the middle of the strait. The Pacific Coast's fishing fleet was built almost entirely of wood, and gasoline killed boats and crews with a regularity that doesn't appear in most histories, because the losses were too small, too scattered, and too ordinary to make the papers. A fisherman lost off Haida Gwaii, a tugboat gone in Johnstone Strait. The sea took them, and the newspapers didn't notice. Diesel changed the calculation entirely. Diesel fuel doesn't explode the way gasoline does. It's heavier, less volatile, and needs compression rather than a spark to ignite. A diesel leak in the bilge was a mess, not a death sentence. The fuel was also far cheaper per running hour. a critical advantage for operators whose profit margins were measured in pennies per pound of landed fish. And diesel engines, properly built, could run at a lower RPM for longer hours with less wear, which meant fewer breakdowns in open water, fewer seasons lost to repairs, fewer widows made by machinery that failed at the wrong moment. The diesel engine had been proving itself in European marine service since the early 1900s, but on the Pacific coast, it remained exotic, oversized, and foreign. Eastern Canadian manufacturers hadn't built one small enough for a coastal workboat. American builders were only beginning to experiment with marine applications. The field was wide open. In the 1920s, Vivian stepped into it. He became, by the authoritative account of the Encyclopedia of British Columbia, the first Canadian company to build a marine diesel engine. It was the defining act of his career, the pivot from a competent local gas engine shop to something genuinely pioneering. And the engine he designed carried every conviction he'd formed at 60 Clementina Street and refined on the water over 15 years of building for the BC fleet. 4-cycle, slow-turning, long-stroke, with a fully enclosed crankcase from the outset. That last detail separated Vivian from his nearest competitor in a way that the operators noticed immediately. The Atlas Imperial diesels coming up from California, built, as it happened, by the successor company to the very Imperial Gas Engine Co., where Vivian had trained as a teenager on Clementina Street, ran with open crankcases. It was an irony that Vivian must have appreciated. His own school, the place that had taught him to build heavy, had produced a competitor whose design he considered fundamentally flawed. Open crankcases meant oil mist hanging in the engine room, dirt grinding into the bearings, and constant maintenance in the wet, salt-heavy conditions of the BC coast. Vivian enclosed his. He built heavy castings with thick walls. He kept the RPM low and the displacement large. The result was an engine that turned slowly, burned fuel with a parsimony that operators talked about for decades, and simply would not stop running. The market was enormous, and it was growing every season. Burrard Inlet's tugboat fleet expanded as the coastal logging industry pushed north, from Howe Sound to Knight Inlet, up the Inside Passage toward Haida Gwaii, into waters so remote that a breakdown meant days of waiting for a tow that might not come. The BC Forest Service was building a patrol fleet to police the coast's timber wealth, boats that ran hard and ran far and couldn't afford engine trouble in a gale off Cape Scott. Small coastal freighters connected communities that had no road access and wouldn't see a highway for a generation or more. And the fishing fleet, Japanese-Canadian seaners, Norwegian trollers, the gillnet boats of the Fraser and the Skeena, was reaching farther every season, chasing salmon runs that took them hundreds of miles from home port into waters where the nearest mechanic was your own two hands. Every one of those vessels needed an engine that could run all day, burn cheap fuel, take salt water in its stride, and survive the Pacific without complaining about it. Vivian's diesel became the standard answer. The product line expanded from those early one-lungers into a range that would eventually run from small 3-cylinder marines up to a 10-cylinder, 9-inch bore by 12-inch stroke behemoth, rated at 500 horsepower. An engine so large it was used not for boats, but for generator sets powering mining camps and remote settlements that would never see a hydro line. David Kahn, the maritime historian who would later write the definitive account of the company, called Will Vivian the Henry Ford of the Canadian diesel industry. The comparison wasn't about volume or assembly lines. It was about conviction, the absolute certainty that one way of building an engine was right, and that the market would come to him rather than the other way around. For 2 decades, it did. Chapter 3. Diesels and Munitions. By the late 1930s, the company had outgrown its original Vancouver shop. A second plant opened in North Vancouver, larger, better equipped, built on the waterfront where finished engines could be craned directly into the hulls waiting below. Young machinists like Frank Outram, who'd already put in time at Boeing's Sea Island facility and the Vancouver shipyard, found their way to Vivian's floor, drawn by steady work and a company that hadn't laid anyone off in a decade. The smell of that shop would have been familiar to any machinist on the Pacific coast. Hot oil, iron filings, the sharp bite of cutting fluid on steel. But the scale was new. The Vivian Works in North Vancouver wasn't a backyard engine shop anymore. It was a factory, and the engines coming off its floor were going into vessels that worked every navigable mile of the BC coast. The product range told the story of the company's ambition. Marine engines ran to 8 cylinders, 320 horsepower naturally aspirated, 400 with a supercharger. Generator sets climbed higher still, to that flagship 10-cylinder unit that could electrify a mining camp or power a gold dredge in the Yukon. The bore and stroke numbers were stamped onto bronze builder's plates that were bolted to each engine block like a signature. 9-12. Vivian Diesel, Vivian Diesels and Munitions Ltd., Vancouver, BC, Canada. Those plates were cast to last as long as the engines themselves. Decades later, long after the company that made them had ceased to exist, they'd surface in maritime antique dealers as far away as Maine. Small bronze rectangles that nobody under 60 could place, testifying to a firm that most Canadians had never heard of. When the war came, Vivian was ready. The company adopted a dual identity that appeared on everything from letterhead to the annual company picnic photograph. Vivian Engine Works Ltd. For the commercial side, Vivian Diesels and Munitions Ltd. For the military contracts. The distinction mattered. It meant the plant was now producing not only engines, but munitions, though the specific ordnance has never been documented in public records. What has been documented, in David Kahn's authoritative account, is the engine output. More than 600 engines for the Canadian military during the Second World War. 600 engines from a single West Coast plant. Consider what that number meant in the context of a factory that had started, 30 years earlier, as one man casting one-lungers in a Vancouver shop. A Vivian Marine Diesel was not an assembly line product stamped out in minutes. It was a multi-ton assembly of cast iron, machined steel, and precision-fitted components. The block poured in the foundry, the cylinders bored on heavy lathes, the crankshaft ground to tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch, each bearing surface hand-scraped by machinists who could feel a high spot through their fingertips. Every engine was built to naval specification, inspected and certified before it shipped east by rail to the builders' yards in Ontario. The tonnage of iron that left the North Vancouver waterfront between 1939 and 1945 was staggering. 600 engines, each weighing several tons, crated and loaded onto flat cars bound for Owen Sound and Kingston. And every one of those engines carried the same DNA that Vivian had brought back from San Francisco as a teenager. Heavy, slow, enclosed, designed to run until the hull around it rotted away. The signature wartime contract was the Royal Canadian Navy's Glenn-class tugboat program. These were steel-hulled tugs designed for harbor duty, convoy escort towing, and the heavy salvage work that a wartime Navy generates in punishing volume, pulling damaged vessels off sandbars, towing crippled freighters into port, clearing harbor debris after U-boat attacks on convoy anchorages. The Glenn program split into 2 designs. The shorthouse variant received American engines, 6-cylinder units from Enterprise Engine and Foundry, built in San Francisco. The longhouse variant, the larger, heavier design, the one that would handle the roughest work, received Vivians. 8-cylinder diesels, 320 horsepower, Canadian-built for Canadian hulls. 11 longhouse Glens came out of Russell Brothers Shipyard in Owen Sound, Ontario. The Glenada, the Glendower, the Glenora, the Glenmont, the Glenlea, and 6 more whose names would scatter across Canadian naval history like seeds. Another 5 were built by Canadian Dredge and Dock in Kingston. Every single one of them carried a Vivian at its heart. 8 cylinders of Vancouver iron, turning at the slow, heavy cadence that Vivian had spent 3 decades perfecting. The contrast with the shorthouse Glens was a point of quiet pride on the North Vancouver shop floor. The smaller tugs ran American. The big ones ran Vivian. For the heaviest, most demanding variant of a wartime tug class, the Royal Canadian Navy had chosen the Canadian engine over the American import. On the BC waterfront, that distinction wasn't lost on anyone. Beyond the Navy contracts, Vivian gensets were powering gold dredges in the Yukon. Massive floating operations that needed reliable electricity in some of the most remote territory on the continent, where a broken generator meant an idle dredge and a season's revenue lost. Mining camps across the BC interior ran on Vivian power. Remote coastal settlements that would never see a hydro line depended on Vivian generators for their lights, their radios, their link to the outside world. The wartime engine contracts were the headline, but the generator business told an equally revealing story. Vivian iron was woven into the infrastructure of the Canadian North in ways that no other Pacific Coast manufacturer could match. The company's ambition showed in civilian ventures, too. In 1939, just before the war shut down everything that wasn't military, Will Vivian had commissioned George Askew, a boat builder working out of Marpole on the Fraser River's North Arm, to construct a personal demonstrator vessel. The boat was large enough and seaworthy enough to carry an 8-ton Vivian diesel across the Pacific to Australia on a promotional voyage that would announce Vivian engines to the world beyond British Columbia. He named her the Leola Vivian. The Australian voyage never happened. The war redirected every shipyard and every diesel engine on the coast to military service, but the boat survived. Renamed the Oliver Clark II, she spent the next 8 decades working the BC coast, passing through different owners and different names. Her Vivian eventually replaced by a newer engine, but her hull still sound. In 2013, at 74 years old, she was still afloat. At 86, she still is. At the PNE, Vancouver's Pacific National Exhibition, the city's annual fair, Vivian diesels took exhibition space on the trade floor, displaying engines with the quiet confidence of a company that knew it had no equal on the coast. Steffens Colmer Studios photographed the booth. The image survives in the City of Vancouver archives, a record of a moment when the company's name meant something that didn't need explaining to anyone who worked the water. And then the war ended. 600 engines shipped, 16 Glenn-class tugs running on Vivian power, a product line that stretched from 3-cylinder fishboat engines to 500 horsepower industrial generators. A workforce that had proven it could deliver military quality at military pace from a single plant on the North Vancouver waterfront. Will Vivian, now in his mid-50s, stood at the head of something remarkable. A company built from nothing by a Vancouver-born machinist, trained in San Francisco, who'd returned home and powered an entire coast. The annual company picnics, captured in a 1944 photograph now held in the City of Vancouver archives, showed a workforce large enough to fill a park. Men and women, machinists and office staff, gathered under both company names, as if the peacetime and wartime identities were simply two faces of the same conviction. After the war, Kahn recorded, Vivian aggressively promoted their engines around the world. The local empire wasn't enough anymore. Vivian could see what every engine builder on the Pacific Rim could see, that the post-war world was hungry for diesel power, that coastlines from Southeast Asia to South America needed exactly the kind of engine he built. Slow, heavy, reliable, designed for operators who measured an engine's worth not in horsepower per pound, but in years between rebuilds. The future, from the summit, looked like it belonged to him. It didn't. Chapter 4. The Summit. Before the cliff. By 1948, Will Vivian was 58 years old, and the man and the company were almost indistinguishable. His engineering convictions hadn't softened with age. If anything, they'd calcified into something closer to doctrine. David Kahn's assessment, drawn from interviews with people who'd known Vivian and worked alongside him, is measured but unmistakable. Vivian resisted the move to light and compact diesel engines, which were easier to install and service, and were produced using mass production methods and more modern metals technology. He'd refused, on principle, to build locomotive engines when the opportunity was offered to him, a market that could have diversified the company and cushioned it against any downturn in the marine trade. He wasn't interested. He built marine diesels. He built them heavy. He built them to last. He'd been right about that for 40 years. He intended to go on being right. The problem was that the rest of the diesel world had stopped agreeing with him. Caterpillar, Detroit Diesel, Cummins. The American giants were pouring wartime engineering advances into high-speed, lightweight engines that could deliver comparable horsepower from a fraction of the weight and volume. Better metallurgy, tighter tolerances, higher RPMs, made reliable by alloys and manufacturing techniques, that hadn't existed when Vivian learned his trade at 60 Clementina Street. A Caterpillar marine diesel could be installed in half the time, serviced by a dealer network that stretched from Seattle to Juneau, and replaced without rebuilding the engine room around it. It couldn't match a Vivian for raw longevity or fuel economy, not even close, as the decades ahead would prove beyond any argument. But it was lighter, cheaper to purchase, and available now. For the operators who ran a single boat and counted every dollar against the next season's catch, that calculation was beginning to shift. A Vivian 8-cylinder weighed tons more than a Caterpillar of comparable horsepower. Tons that displaced fuel capacity. Tons that ate into a hull's carrying ability. Tons that meant a heavier, deeper, more expensive boat to begin with. For the tugboat companies watching their competitors refit with lighter American iron, the pressure was commercial and immediate. And for Will Vivian, standing in his North Vancouver plant surrounded by engines that would still be running on the BC coast 80 years later, the tide was turning in a direction his engineering philosophy couldn't follow, and his temperament wouldn't accommodate. He was right about the engines. History would settle that question beyond any dispute. Vivian diesels are still turning on the BC coast today, 8 decades on, long after the Caterpillars and Detroits that replaced them have been scrapped, recycled, and forgotten. But being right about the engines and being right about the market are two different kinds of right, and the second is the one that keeps a company alive. In 1949, Will Vivian, 59 years old, the dominant engine builder on the Canadian Pacific Coast, a man whose conviction in heavy iron had never once been proven wrong, made the decision that would determine not just his company's future, but the fate of everything he'd ever built. He sold. Chapter 5. The Men from Loughborough. Will Vivian sold his interest in the company in 1949. He was 59 years old. He'd built the first Canadian marine diesel engine, powered the BC coast for 3 decades, delivered 600 engines to the Canadian military, and earned a reputation among Pacific Coast operators that no amount of advertising could have purchased. The man whom David Kahn called the Henry Ford of the Canadian diesel industry signed his life's work over to a group of men from the English Midlands who had never set foot on a tugboat in Johnstone Strait and whose understanding of the Pacific Coast diesel market could have fit on the back of a builder's plate. The buyer was the Brush Abo Group, based in Loughborough, Leicestershire, an industrial combine assembled over the previous decade by a man named Alan Paul Good. Good had served as deputy chairman of Brush Electrical Engineering from 1939 and managing director from 1941, and he'd spent the post-war years building something that looked, on paper, like a rational solution to the fragmented state of the British diesel industry. Through the late 1940s, he'd been buying engine companies with the systematic thoroughness of a man following a plan. Petter of Staines, acquired in 1937 before the war. Mearleys Bickerton and Day of Stockport, acquired in 1948. J. and H. McLaren of Leeds, the same year. Henry Meadows of Wolverhampton, alongside them. The ABOE in the group name stood for Associated British Oil Engines. It was a roll-up strategy. Consolidate every significant British diesel builder under one roof, then rationalize production across the portfolio. Large engines to Mearleys at Stockport, medium engines to McLaren at Leeds, small engines to Petter at Staines. Each plant would do one thing, efficiently, without duplicating what the sister plants were already doing. It was rational. It was orderly. And it was entirely British in its assumptions, the assumptions of a small, dense country where factories sat within a few hours' rail of each other, and a single parent company could coordinate production across a handful of Midlands and northern towns as easily as a shopkeeper rearranging goods on adjacent shelves. Vivian Diesels and Munitions Limited was folded into this structure in 1950, the formal corporate consolidation completing a deal that Will Vivian had agreed to the year before. The same tranche brought in National Gas and Oil Engine Company of Ashton-under-Lyne and Hopkinson Electric Company. On paper, the Vancouver operation was now part of a British diesel empire that stretched from Loughborough to Leeds, to Stockport, to Staines, to Vancouver. On the water, 4,000 miles from the nearest sister plant, nothing about that sentence made any sense at all. The machinists on the North Vancouver floor, men like Frank Outram, who'd chosen Vivian over Boeing and the shipyard because Vivian built things that lasted, woke up one morning to discover that their employer was no longer a Vancouver company, run by a Vancouver man who walked the floor and knew every casting by its number. Their employer was now a British conglomerate headquartered in the East Midlands, managed by executives who were rationalizing engine factories the way a rail dispatcher reroutes freight, by capacity, by category, by the logic of a system that had been designed for a country that could be crossed in a day. Why Vivian sold is a question the surviving record can answer only in part, because the records that would have settled it completely were destroyed a quarter-century later. Kahn's account stresses the competitive pressures that were closing in from every direction. The American high-speed diesels from Caterpillar and Detroit Diesel and Cummins that Vivian had refused to build. The post-war shift toward lighter, mass-produced engines that could be installed and serviced by a wider network of mechanics. The rising cost of maintaining a heavy casting, low-volume, hand-finished production line against companies that could stamp out a marine engine in a fraction of the time and sell it for a fraction of the price. The tariff wall that had protected BC manufacturers was lower than it had been. The American dealer networks were pushing north. The market that had once been captive, held in place by geography and trade policy, was opening, and the engines coming through that opening were everything Vivian's were not: light, fast, cheap, and disposable. Vivian's own engineering philosophy, the quality that had made his engines supreme, had become the quality that made his company most vulnerable to exactly this kind of pressure. He wouldn't build light. He wouldn't build fast. He wouldn't diversify into locomotive engines or industrial applications beyond generator sets. He was a marine diesel man, and he built marine diesels the way he'd been taught at 60 Clementina Street 40 years earlier: heavy and slow and built to last forever. And by 1949, the question wasn't whether the world still needed heavy, slow-turning diesels. The engines themselves would answer that question for the next 8 decades. The question was whether a single independent works in North Vancouver could go on building them while the giants scaled and the conglomerates consolidated. The answer, apparently, was no. Will Vivian took the British money and stepped away from the company he'd founded at 19. He would live another 16 years, dying in 1965 at 75. Whether he walked away in relief or in defeat, in quiet resignation, or in the private certainty that his engines would outlast whatever the men from Loughborough did to his company, nobody now alive can say. What the record does show is that from the moment the papers were signed, the decisions about what happened on the North Vancouver shop floor were no longer made by someone who knew the coast. Chapter 6. The Wrong Engines for the Wrong Coast. The logic of the Brush ABOE group was specialization. Each plant would build one class of engine, and the group would cover the full range of the British and Commonwealth diesel market from a coordinated portfolio. Large, slow-speed diesels went to Mearleys at Stockport. Medium-speed units went to McLaren at Leeds. Small high-speed engines went to Petter at Staines. Every factory had its assigned lane, every product range its designated builder. The overlap and competition that had characterized the pre-war British diesel industry would be eliminated by the rational hand of central planning. In that scheme, the Vancouver works had no obvious manufacturing role. The engines Vivian had built for 40 years, heavy, slow-turning, large displacement marines designed for the specific conditions of the Canadian Pacific, didn't map onto any of the categories that Brush was rationalizing around. They weren't the enormous, slow-speed units that Mearleys built for power stations and large ships. They weren't the compact, high-speed engines in the Petter range. They were something entirely their own. A regional masterpiece, designed by a man who knew his customers' boats by name and his waters by decades of experience, purpose-built for a market that existed nowhere else on Earth and that couldn't be served from Stockport or Staines or anywhere that wasn't within crane reach of Burrard Inlet. What happened next is where the documented record thins and the analysis sharpens. David Kahn's account, written while Vivian employees were still alive to recall the transition in detail, states plainly that the Vivian brand disappeared in the early 50s. The Brush ABOE plant specialization strategy, documented in the group's own corporate records, left no manufacturing function for a Pacific Coast works that had been building a unique product line with no equivalent in the British portfolio. The inference, supported by the corporate strategy but not yet confirmed by internal correspondence, which was destroyed, is that the Vancouver plant was redirected from building Vivian-designed engines to selling and servicing British-designed engines imported from the Midlands plants. If that inference is correct, and everything in the record points toward it, the mismatch would have been immediate and devastating. It was not a matter of British engines being poorly built. Petter and Mirrlees and McLaren all made competent machinery for the markets they were designed to serve. The problem was that the market they were designed to serve was not this one. Consider what the BC operators actually needed. A tugboat working the inside passage, hauling log booms through Seymour Narrows, where the tidal current runs fast enough to capsize a vessel that loses power at the wrong moment, needed an engine that could hold its RPM against a load that changed by the second as the current shifted. It needed mass. It needed the flywheel inertia of heavy iron spinning at low RPM, storing energy like a mechanical battery, and releasing it in the smooth, uninterrupted torque that kept the tow line taut when the sea tried to slacken it. A fishing boat running out to the halibut grounds off Haida Gwaii, 3 days from the nearest mechanic, needed an engine whose parts were thick enough to tolerate a missed oil change, whose bearings were generous enough to run hot without seizing, whose entire design philosophy was built around the assumption that perfection in maintenance was impossible, and the engine had to survive imperfection. A coastal freighter threading the islands of Desolation Sound in a winter gale needed power that was predictable, fuel-efficient, and above all, heavy enough to absorb the punishment of working in open Pacific conditions for years without major overhaul. These operators had built their lives and their livelihoods around Vivian power. They knew every sound the engine made, the particular exhaust note at cruising RPM, the way the block vibrated when a cylinder was running cool, the sound of the fuel injectors firing in sequence like a slow heartbeat. They knew the fuel consumption at every load. They knew that a Vivian, properly maintained, would outlast them and their sons after them. Now imagine handing those operators a catalog for a British engine they'd never heard of. A Petter Marine diesel, designed for the relatively sheltered waters of the English Channel or the North Sea, lighter and faster turning than anything they'd run before, built to tolerances that assumed a service depot within a day's sail and a parts supply chain that ran through a Midlands warehouse 4,000 miles and 6 weeks of shipping away. The operators didn't need to read the specifications to understand the problem. They could feel it. A lighter engine in a heavy sea does not behave the way a Vivian behaved. It doesn't hold the same RPM against the same load. It doesn't absorb the same punishment from a skipper who doesn't have time to baby his machinery when there's a log boom to deliver and a tide to catch. It doesn't carry the same reserve of iron and inertia that made a Vivian diesel feel, to the man standing above it in a pitching engine room, like the safest thing on the water. The sales decline, once it began, would have been swift and irreversible. These were not customers who could be educated or marketed into acceptance. A tugboat operator who'd run a Vivian for 20 years, who could diagnose a cylinder problem by ear and service the injectors on his own deck with a wrench and a coffee can for the overflow, wasn't going to switch to an unknown British import when a Caterpillar dealer sat right there in Vancouver with an engine he could inspect, a parts catalog he could read, and a service network that ran from Seattle to Juneau to Ketchikan. The Cat wasn't as good as the Vivian. Nothing was. And the decades ahead would prove it beyond any argument. But the Cat was North American. The Cat was available next week, not next season. And the Cat didn't require a skipper to trust a company in Loughborough, England, that had just killed the only Canadian engine he'd ever wanted to run. Alan Paul Good, the architect of the consolidation that had produced this outcome, didn't live to see the full consequences of his strategy's failure on the Pacific coast. He died in February 1953 in South Africa, after a long illness, at 54 years old. Good had also served as chairman of Associated British Engineering and of Heenan and Froude, a man who sat at the center of a web of British industrial companies and managed them with the confidence of someone who believed that rational organization could solve any problem of scale or geography. His death at 54 removed the one executive who might have understood that the Vancouver works demanded exceptional treatment. that a factory 4,000 miles from Loughborough, serving a market with no parallel in Britain, couldn't be managed by the same rationalization logic that worked between Stockport and Staines. Whatever flexibility the system might have had died with him. Without Good, the Brush Group lost whatever strategic coherence it had possessed, and the Vivian brand, already absent from the Pacific Coast engine market, disappeared entirely. Kahn places the extinction of the name in the early 1950s, meaning the company that Will Vivian had built over 4 decades survived less than 5 years under its new owners. In 1957, the brush companies were absorbed into the Hawker Siddeley Group, a vast British conglomerate with interests in aviation, railway equipment, electrical generation, and military contracting that dwarfed the diesel portfolio the way a cathedral dwarfs a parish hall. Vivian, if anyone at Hawker Siddeley even noticed the name in the ledger, was a footnote inside. A footnote inside a conglomerate that was itself about to be traded like a commodity. But the weight of the tragedy requires honest distribution. Vivian's own stubbornness, the stubbornness that had made his engines great, shares responsibility for what the British finished. Kahn's assessment carries no ambiguity. Vivian resisted the move to light and compact diesel engines, which were easier to install and service, and were produced using mass production methods and more modern metals technology. He'd turned down locomotive contracts that could have diversified the company's revenue. He'd ignored the American high-speed revolution that was reshaping the global marine market. He'd wagered everything on the belief that the world would always want what he built, the way he built it. The British didn't destroy a company at the height of its powers. They bought one whose founder had already chosen a path that the post-war world was leaving behind. The decline has 2 authors, one in Vancouver, one in Loughborough, and neither of them intended the ending. Chapter 7. The Vanishing. After Hawker Siddeley absorbed the brush companies in 1957, the Vivian name entered a corporate labyrinth from which it would never emerge. Hawker Siddeley was enormous. Aircraft, locomotives, electrical equipment, bridge steel, defense contracts spanning 3 continents. And a defunct diesel brand from a small plant in North Vancouver sat nowhere on its list of priorities. The assets, whatever remained of them, passed into the administrative custody of Hawker Siddeley's Canadian operating arm, Canadian Car and Foundry. CC&F had its own history. It had built railway rolling stock and military vehicles from plants in Montreal and Thunder Bay. But it had no connection to the Pacific Coast, no knowledge of marine diesel engineering, no institutional memory of what Vivian had been or what it had built. And sometime in the 1970s, acting with the bureaucratic efficiency of a company disposing of storage it no longer wanted to pay for, Canadian Car and Foundry destroyed the Vivian records. All of them. The engineering drawings that showed how every Vivian diesel had been designed. The bore specifications, the bearing clearances, the casting dimensions, the metallurgical notes on what alloys Vivian had used, and how he'd heat-treated the critical components. The production logs that recorded every engine built, every serial number assigned, every vessel that carried a Vivian out of the North Vancouver works. The pattern books, and the physical wooden patterns themselves, the molds from which every Vivian casting had been poured. Patterns that represented 40 years of iterative refinement, and that were irreplaceable in the most literal sense of the word. Without those patterns, no one could ever manufacture a new Vivian cylinder block, a new crankcase, a new bearing housing. Every Vivian diesel still running on the coast was now running on finite parts. When something wore out or broke, there would be no replacement, only improvisation, adaptation, or silence. The correspondence files, the procurement records, the wartime contracts that would have documented the specific munitions production, and the dollar values of 600 military engines. The personnel records of the machinists who'd built them. Gone. Disposed of as the dead paperwork of a company that no longer existed by people in Thunder Bay who had no idea what the boxes in their storage room contained or what it would mean to the operators still running Vivian iron on the Pacific Coast when the last spare part was used and no more could be made. Will Vivian's personal papers followed the same path into oblivion. After his death in 1965 at 75, Whatever survived of the man's working life, his letters, his technical notes, his records of 40 years spent designing and building marine engines, the correspondence with operators and naval procurement officers and brush executives that might have explained exactly what happened in the years after the sale, was destroyed. By whom and under what circumstances the surviving record doesn't say. What it says is that the destruction was complete. The man who built the first Canadian marine diesel left behind no archive, no memoir, no personal account of what he'd built or why he'd sold it, or what he thought of what the British did with it afterward. His engines survive. His voice does not. The result was a documentary blackout so total that it explains everything about why Vivian Engine Works is unknown today. Not just to the general public, but to the industrial historians who should have written its story, to the maritime museums that should have preserved its artifacts, and to the very communities on the BC coast that it served for 40 years. How does a company that built the first Canadian marine diesel, that powered the Pacific Coast fishing and logging fleets, that delivered 600 engines to the wartime military and put its iron into Royal Canadian Navy tugs and gold dredges and mining camps from the Fraser River Delta to the Yukon interior? How does a company like that simply vanish from public memory? The answer is not neglect. It is not the slow fade of time. It is a specific act of destruction, committed by a specific successor company in a specific decade, that erased 40 years of industrial history as thoroughly as if the company had never existed. The only comprehensive account of the company that survives is a single article, David Kahn's Will Vivian, Pioneer Engine Builder, published in Raincoast Chronicles No. 9 by Harbor Publishing in the mid-1970s, written at the last possible moment, while some of the original Vivian employees were still alive to be interviewed. Without Kahn, the company would be entirely lost to public memory. With him, it survives, but as a single magazine article, not as the industrial archive that 40 years of engine building should have produced. And the brand itself, the residual intellectual property, the corporate shell, whatever the Vivian name was worth as a line item on a balance sheet, it kept moving through a chain of transactions that had nothing to do with diesel engines and everything to do with the restless mathematics of corporate finance. Hawker Siddeley's electrical power division was seized in a hostile takeover by BTR in November 1991 for £1.5 billion. BTR sold the same division to the FKI Group in November 1996 for $182 million, less than an eighth of what it had cost 5 years earlier. FKI was acquired by Melrose on the 1st of July 2008. Melrose sold to One Equity Partners in 2021. One Equity sold to Greenbelt Capital Partners in 2025. 7 owners since Will Vivian signed the papers in 1949. The Vancouver plant vanished at the first transaction. The brand name has been traded 6 times since, by people in boardrooms in London and New York who could not have found North Vancouver on a map and who would not have recognized a Vivian builder's plate if one were sitting on their desk. Chapter 8. Still running. The company is gone. The records are gone. The patterns, the drawings, the correspondence, the builder who made them. All of it, gone. The engines are not. On the BC coast today, more than 8 decades after they were cast in a North Vancouver foundry, Vivian diesels are still running. Not as museum curiosities behind glass. As working machines, turning in the holds of boats that still fish and still tow and still haul, doing the job they were designed for, in the water they were designed for, at the slow, heavy cadence that Will Vivian set when he poured his first marine diesel casting in the 1920s. The MV Perry is the one still earning her keep. Built in 1941 as a wooden-hulled tugboat, she carries her original Vivian diesel below decks, 85 years old and running. Westwind Tugboat Adventures operates her on the BC coast, and the sound of that engine at idle is something you feel in your chest before you hear it in your ears. A deep, rhythmic thump, one combustion stroke at a time, unhurried and certain, with the bass resonance of heavy iron doing exactly what it was made to do. The engine room smells of hot oil and old iron, and the particular mineral warmth that comes off a machine that has been running longer than most people have been alive. At Britannia Beach, north of Vancouver, on the Sea to Sky Highway, the Britannia Mine Museum displays a Vivian diesel on its floor, a National Historic Site preserving not just the mine, but the industrial machinery that served it. Stripped of its hull and open to view, the engine's scale is startling. The block alone is the size of a small car. The flywheel is a disc of cast iron that two men couldn't lift. Standing next to it, a visitor begins to understand why these engines survived when everything around them, the company, the records, the industry, did not. They were built as if their maker believed iron was the only material that could be trusted to carry the truth forward. In Chilliwack, at the Achilles Threshermen's Association, 4 Vivian engines sit in a collection that constitutes the most significant gathering of Vivian iron outside a working vessel. They arrived in 2013, transferred from the Vancouver Maritime Museum by John Black and Frank Vanden Dorpel, a straight-8 marine engine from the Leola Vivian herself, the demonstrator Will Vivian had built for the Australian voyage that the war prevented. A 4-cylinder marine, a 3-cylinder marine, and a rare 60 to 80 horsepower 3-cylinder gasoline engine recovered from a tug that worked out of Port Alberni. 4 engines, 4 decades of engineering, saved from a museum that no longer had room for them by a Threshermen's Association that understood what they were. And then there's the Glenada, one of the original Longhouse Glen-class tugs built by Russell Brothers in Owen Sound during the war. Vivian powered from the day she was launched. She survived the war, survived decades of hard service, and made it all the way to Thunder Bay, where she sits today. But her original Vivian 8-cylinder is gone, destroyed, according to the people who knew her, in a catastrophic mechanical failure. The word they use is blown up. She was re-engined with a Caterpillar D399, and she carries on under American power now. It is the one Vivian survivor story that ends the way the company's story ended. The Canadian iron removed, the replacement installed, and the vessel carrying on under a different heart, as if the original had never existed. The bronze builder's plates outlast everything. Small rectangles of cast bronze stamped with bore and stroke, and company name, Vivian Diesels and Munitions, Ltd., Vancouver, BC, Canada. They surface in maritime antique markets and online auctions from the BC coast to the eastern seaboard. The Skipjack Marine Gallery in Maine has handled them. Private collectors trade them, knowing that the company behind the stamp no longer exists, and that the engineering records that would explain what each plate was bolted to were destroyed by a railway company in Thunder Bay that had never heard the name Vivian, and never would. Chapter 9. What an engine remembers. A Vivian diesel doesn't know that the company that built it is gone. It doesn't know that the drawings were burned, that the patterns were scrapped, that the brand has been traded through 7 corporate owners without any of them noticing it was there. The engine knows one thing only, the next combustion stroke, and the next, and the one after that. It has been doing this for 80 years, and it will go on doing it for as long as someone feeds it fuel and oil and has the sense to leave it alone. Will Vivian built for this, and nothing else. Not for quarterly earnings or shareholder returns, or the rationalization strategies of men in Loughborough who'd never tasted salt spray off a crankcase vent. He built for the fisherman who needed to come home, for the tugboat skipper who couldn't afford a breakdown in a following sea, for the logging camp operator who wanted a generator that would outlast the camp itself. He built heavy because heavy lasted. He built slow because slow endured. He refused to change because he believed, with the stubbornness that was both his greatest strength and the crack through which the British eventually entered, that the things that worked would always be needed, no matter what the market said. The market moved on. The company didn't survive it. The records didn't last the decade after his death. The man who built it all died quietly in Vancouver in 1965, and the papers that documented his life's work were thrown away by people who didn't know what they held and wouldn't have cared if they had. But the engines, the heavy, slow, overbuilt, deliberately conservative engines that Will Vivian cast in a North Vancouver foundry, because he believed that iron outlasts everything else. The engines are still here, still turning, still proving him right about the one thing that mattered most to him, long after the market and the company and the records and the man himself have gone. The MV Perry heads out in the early morning, her hull cutting the harbor water, her Vivian turning below decks at the same cadence it has held since 1941. The exhaust note carries across the inlet, low, steady, unhurried. And then the boat rounds the point, and the sound fades, and the water closes behind her. And the silence that settles over the harbor is the silence of a coast that has already forgotten the name of the man whose iron is still keeping it running.